Love staying informed? Subscribe now and get unlimited access to local news, weather, and sports for just 99 cents a month for your first 3 months at inforum.news/join. Read every story, listen to every podcast, and download the apps that keep you informed and on the go 24 hours a day. So head to inforum.news/join right now to subscribe. What are you waiting for? Get 3 months of local news for just 99 cents a month at inforum.news/join.
Welcome to Plain Talk, and we're going to focus on national security. One thing to talk about is our border with Canada, and when we talk about border security, immediately one's mind goes to the southern border, where there's been obviously a very large problem. It's been a problem for a long time. People don't realize our northern border is pretty scantily defended, and maybe that's because Canada, frankly, doesn't have a lot of the problems that our friends in Mexico do. Sure. But that doesn't mean that the border doesn't need to be defended. So we're going to talk a little bit about that with my guest, Senator Kevin Cramer. We're going to talk about CO2 pipelines. But before we get into that, let's talk about President Joe Biden visiting Ukraine, which I thought was a good thing. I'm trying to adhere to that idea that politics ends at the water's edge, right? Which seems like a quaint notion these days, but I mean, I still believe in that. I am glad that our president is over there talking about our commitment to opposing Russian aggression and supporting our friends in Ukraine. I was glad he went. I didn't see a lot of room to criticize him. Now, I think back home here we can there's some room for criticism. But Senator, what did you think of that trip?
So first of all, I thought the trip was gutsy, and I thought it was appropriate. And the fact that he went into Ukraine itself, went right to Kyiv, Kyiv's not exactly the belly of the beast, but it is the head of the beast, and it is the head that Vladimir Putin was hoping he could take off in the first few days of the war effort. And obviously that didn't work out. I think one of the things you have to admire Vladimir Zelensky for, if nothing else, it's that he stayed. And even when he was offered asylum by the United States and others, he stayed. And
Kyiv's a war zone. Kyiv's a war zone.
Really,
it's the edge. It's the edge of a war zone, but it's a war zone. The fact that our president went there, that's a big deal.
I think it matters, and I think he deserves credit for that. The problem with, I think with Joe Biden, and we've talked about this before, is that he tends to think out loud. So when he gets to these places, he gets wrapped up in the conversation with allies or adversaries, in this case, obviously allies, and he starts talking tough and big, and pretty soon he's promising blank checks and open accounts. And as you know, president's words, we went through this with the previous president, with President Trump. President's words matter a lot. They're watched, they're recorded, they're amplified, they're dissected, and so that was a little bit unfortunate. But Rob, again, I don't have any trouble with him going there. I think it was a good move. I think it makes us look good as a country. And then I think, frankly, his trip the next day to Poland was also important and very valuable. Poland, of course, many people see as, first of all, the biggest recipient of refugees from Ukraine, which is true. They've certainly stepped up and provided lots of sanctuary for Ukrainian people. They also are most likely, at least most often, considered the next target of Vladimir Putin, who has been pretty open about his desire to
most recently Ukraine. He's talking about wanting to roll some of Poland's borders back. So
right. Exactly right.
I mean, our Polish friends are rightly very engaged on this front and very concerned about Russian aggression. Yep. And also, I mean, that's been one of the issues, like with tanks, for instance, and obviously Germany has been a part of this as well. But I think Poland has expressed some frustration with Germany, and I think by extension with the United States, about the ability to, obviously not just get money and get supplies in there, but even allow some of our allies to provide money and supplies. They've expressed frustration. Do you think Poland's right to be frustrated with us?
Yeah, I think they are right to be frustrated, particularly with the NATO nations in Europe. So the United States, I think in the early going, one of the challenges for the Trump administration, or I'm sorry, for the Biden administration, was that they didn't respond quickly and they didn't respond very big. And they still really don't. $113 billion has been appropriated so far for Ukraine. I think they're still sitting on over $40 billion. And so the president dribbles it out, a couple billion here and a couple billion there. And he's been pretty late in a lot of cases getting munitions where they needed to get. But
you
we
said
also
who's sitting on the 40 billion? Ukraine sitting on the 40 billion?
The United States.
Okay, we are.
So that's why that when he goes on a trip like this and he promises more money, and today or yesterday they announced another $2 billion. I think people need to realize that's not $2 new billion. That's $2 billion from the money that's previously appropriated. Because if you're adding it all up, it's about $113 billion total from the United States. Only about 70 billion of which, maybe not even quite, has actually been sent and spent. A good chunk of that is actually not money at all. It's munitions. A lot of it's stockpiled munitions. A lot of it's very old munitions. But we're to a point now, Rob, where we have to build up our own stockpiles, and to do that we have to kick in our own defense industry. And so there's a lot of complexity to all of this, but I think Ukraine has been rightly concerned about the pace at which they've been getting, particularly the military assistance they need. Now, you bring up Germany and Great Britain, the two biggest players, obviously the biggest supporters in Europe of Ukraine and its border countries. But even Europe altogether doesn't come. They come close, but I think we're 113 billion. They're maybe 80 billion, something like that they've supported with. But at the same time, we have to remember they're the ones taking in a lot of the refugees. They're the ones that are losing energy supplies from Russia and things like that.
They're paying a lot of costs that aren't included in that total.
A lot of other costs. There's no question about it. But now you're seeing everybody step up a little bigger, particularly the United Kingdom and Germany. The tanks are an important one, Rob. At the end of the day, and this is not radical, I don't think, but this is pretty well where I am. I don't think we can give them a blank check, and nor should we, because that'll always be leveraged, I think, against us, and people will draw the binary conclusions all the time that, well, we need money for our own use, including our southern border, and they're right, we do. All of that said, we need Ukraine to win. I personally would just as soon see us give them whatever they need to win quickly, as opposed to sort of dribble it out over the course of decades in hopes that they win someday. I just think I think early on we weren't all in. I think now we need to be all in if we're going to be in at all.
Well, I think honestly, I think a war. I mean, it's hard to say, because on one hand, how long can Vladimir Putin sustain this? How long can he continue to send Russian troops, Russian men and women into a meat grinder? How long is his political support going to last, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, on the other hand, part of what worries me is that eventually we're going to have a ceasefire. Now, obviously, I don't see any
Sure.
Zelensky is not he's not on board with that. But eventually, that we're going to see a ceasefire, and then Russia is going to have gained some. And frankly, I don't want to see them coming out of this with any reward, because I think it just tempts them for further aggression. Maybe next time Poland, which, by the way, Poland's a NATO member, and that becomes a much trickier international problem.
Well, at that point, we are obligated to respond in defense of our NATO allies. And I think this is something that's lost on a lot of American citizens, but we should remind them of it, and that's important. The other thing about this is, with your point about a ceasefire and what would Zelensky accept, to his credit, he's accepted nothing short of the original boundaries of Ukraine.
Get out of my country, basically.
That's right. That's exactly right. So and these were the ones that agreed to by Russia and Ukraine, along with the United States and the United Kingdom, in the Budapest Memorandum in 1994. And now that means that in recent years, the last couple of decades, Russia's already changed those borders by it going into Crimea, for example, and other areas. So far, everybody's all or nothing, and I get that. Whether or not there's some line that Zelensky thinks, well, okay, we're willing to give that for peace or to secure people or keep people from being killed anymore, that's going to be up to him for sure. But at this point, I think he's right on, and I think you're right to be concerned if if Putin is rewarded in any way, shape, or form, it would be unfortunate.
How do we? One of the things, because you were talking about not wanting President Biden to be writing blank checks, and I agree with that. Only because I think that becomes tricky. If it's a blank check, then we're obligating ourselves to whatever Ukraine asks for, and if we ever say no to Ukraine, now we're going back on the blank check. That becomes tricky. As much as I support Ukraine, I don't want blank checks either. That being said, one of the challenges we always have as the United States in this is that we're a democracy, and we have to navigate through this. Not everybody in Congress wants to support Ukraine. Not everybody in the United States obviously wants to support Ukraine. A lot of us would some of them would like us just to get out now and stop supporting them and let Ukraine and Russia figure it out, which I think would be a terrible, terrible mistake. So that always seems the difficult part. How do we have robust debate and honor the fact that we're a democracy without creating uncertainty for our allies? That always seems like a very difficult thing. How do you, as a senator, like when you're thinking about how I talk publicly, how I vote in the Senate, how do we balance that? How do you balance that?
This is why I do your podcast every couple of weeks, and why I do so much other talking, and why it grieves me that many of my colleagues do not, because politics today has gotten to a point where gravitating to the lowest common denominator is the easy way to re-election, but it's not responsible. And, Abraham Lincoln always talked to the people, and he didn't have podcasts and the media. Ronald Reagan, he didn't do a lot of town halls or have a lot of visits or a lot of news conferences, but he talked to the American people. And I think we need to do a better job. And by the way, I think some of this, frankly, comes down to our education system. It's amazing to me, and I have to remind myself occasionally, especially when I watch the House of Representatives and some of the people that are the most adamantly opposed to our involvement in Ukraine, or even a few of my Senate colleagues. They're generally young. And when I say young, I mean they didn't ever live through the Cold War. They didn't know Ronald Reagan. They never had an opportunity to vote for him or against him. They don't understand Margaret Thatcher and the Pope, and for that matter, Mikhail Gorbachev, and what all went in to shaping Russia as it is today, and by extension, Ukraine, and what we provided in terms of the security to Europe, security to Japan, security, to South Korea, all of the things that keep further, nuclear arms from getting into even more countries. We provide that security in response to them giving up their nuclear weapons. There's so much more to this that I'm afraid people don't know because they aren't told.
Well, I think too, a lot of that, the way that a lot of that history, you're talking about a generation. I'm that generation. Yeah. I was born in 1980, so I was born the first year he was elected. And so a lot of our perception of the Cold War era, the Reagan era, is filtered through popular culture. So it's movies and television shows. And I mean, not all of it's bad. Tom Clancy exists. His novels are very popular. But, right. But on the other side, it's, a lot of that's been portrayed in ways I think that were pretty one-sided and pretty unfair. And so when people are thinking about this, it's just all, and let's face it, our adventure in Iraq didn't help, because of a lot of the things that we went through. It wasn't. Let's just say that it left a bad taste in people's mouth, and so I think there are some people who think, oh, here we go on another adventure in Ukraine, and it's just like my generation's touchstone is Iraq and Afghanistan, which didn't necessarily end so well for us.
That's right.
So that's right. I think that's the lens where we're seeing it through.
I think that's exactly right. I think the people put Ukraine into the same bucket as failed policies in the Middle East, and there's some fairness to that. I mean, we did we did it, and we shouldn't have done some of it, and we can't be the world's policeman. But it's interesting. You raise a point about the lenses with which we look through things. Getting back to Abraham Lincoln, and I keep studying him more and more, and I give a lot of Lincoln Day speeches, of course. But when he was 28 years old, and that was 1844, he did a speech it's now called the Lyceum Speech. It was called the Perpetuation of America's Political Institutions. And the premise of his point was that at that point, they were one generation removed from the founders. So, the founders and their children and their spouses, widows and whatnot, had pretty much gone. There were still some, but the passions of people were such that, and he warned about this, don't let the passions replace the institutions. And what he was speaking of is that leaders never want to plow the previous leader's ground. They always want to plow their own ground. And that leads to different choices and forgetting the foundation that they're standing on. And he's exactly right. And that's what we see, I think, generation after generation, and why so many, in some cases, errors are repeated. And in other cases, we don't understand what America was actually built on and why we are who we are and why we do have greater responsibilities and why, abandoning third world countries comes with a price. When China suddenly becomes a superpower because they took over the areas, filled the voids that we left. And that's not to say that all of these are the right positions, but I do think the lens of history is really, really important and not appreciated enough by more people.
We great segue, Senator, bringing up China, because that's where we're going next with balloons. And although obviously China is the extent to which China is going to be willing to back Russia's play in in Ukraine is an open question.
It is, yeah.
But this balloon situation was I don't know, because there's some people who think, we're blowing it out of proportion. It's not that big of a threat. And other people are like, no, this is what we've been talking about. China's a major threat. They're flying balloons over sensitive parts of our country. What's your take on this? How seriously are we taking this?
So I think we're taking it quite seriously, but I do think there's been some overreaction to certain parts of it. But again, I would blame that as much as anything on the administration's response to it. And by response, I don't mean not shooting it out of the sky over Alaska. I mean, you're familiar with Alaska. There's about one person per square mile, but that one person, does live there, and they might be in an elementary school, and there's lots of reasons to not oversimplify the challenge. But to me, there's a couple of things in terms of the response. First thing is, why would China feel like they actually could do what they did? Send a balloon at 65,000 feet, visible to the naked eye, to spy on sensitive areas of the United States. What emboldens them to do that, except that they perceive some weakness or they have some other strategy involved? The other thing then is, the administration just didn't get in front of it soon enough. They didn't talk about it. They still really don't. I've been in 2 briefings, secure briefings on just this topic, and several others in the last 2 weeks on China in general, on their nuclear capabilities or space capabilities. I mean, most of what we do in the Armed Services Committee these days involves some aspect of China's adversarial position. All of that said, I don't think the spy balloon itself was that big a deal, quite honestly. Our intelligence community knew about the program. They followed this balloon from its very launch. They knew where it was at all times. The problem is that our intelligence community oftentimes hoards information, way too often hoards information. They don't share it, even when they're supposed to. We've set up entire systems for them to share data so that others in the government are aware of it. So by the time NORTHCOM and NORAD, in other words, our combatant command for the Arctic, by the time they knew it was coming our direction, they had very difficult decisions to make at the very last minute. And I think they made all the right ones, quite honestly. But they had enough advance warning to shut all of the missile silos, to make sure that all of our aircraft were in hangars, to make sure that we weren't sending sensitive information to our satellites or to other aircraft, and that data was shut down. I don't think they learned anything about us other than that we don't respond very well from their spy balloon. But what did happen was there was tremendous reputational harm, and that's in terms of deterrence. Reputation is one of the biggest deterrents that the United States has.
The perception was the reality is not that we were taken by surprise by this, as you noted.
That's right.
We had our eyeballs on this. The perception, that was my perception when I first learned about it. How the hell did this balloon get over Montana without nobody hearing about it? Like, why?
Right.
Why didn't? I mean, it seems like, and I don't know. I mean, I would have said, listen, the minute it's on the edge of our airspace, we'd say, listen, we see you, China. We see what you're trying to do, and we're going to knock your silly balloons out of the sky as soon as we get around to it. But we're not threatened.
Right.
I mean, there's a much better approach to that. Give me some confidence that we know what we're doing with this, because I think you're right. We have the confidence. We're protected. We're okay. I don't want to overreact to this, but give the public that confidence. That there was an information vacuum there that created a real problem.
My point exactly, Rob. You said it perfectly. Because when left to the imagination can run pretty wild. And when left to the imagination, when you feel like you might not be safe, you're going to you mentally and literally have to prepare for the worst case scenario.
Well, especially every rando's got a Twitter account and a Facebook account and a TikTok account, and if you don't put the official narrative out there, they're more than happy to invent one for you, whether it's exactly true or not, unfortunately. So,
and by the way, China has learned this about us, and this is something they probably learned through this experience as well. That they've taken full advantage of our very open system.
Sure.
I wouldn't trade our very open system with their very efficient one for anything in the world, but we do have to recognize it. And I think, to your point, it does not take a great deal of effort or creativity to inform the American public, particularly when you know it's going to be seen by the naked eye. And how about calling some governors? How about calling the governor of Montana, well in advance and say, hey, there's this air balloon coming in your direction. We're shutting down Malmstrom Air Force Base. They won't see anything, but want to make sure that you're aware of it. And those are the kinds of things and the protocols that have not been in place that should have been.
I perceive, and I'm not making an excuse for this. This is not an excuse. We've all got to do better. But part of the problem, I think, is that we're so polarized and there's so much distrust in government between the public and the government, and then the government even within itself, that it seems like nobody wants to have those conversations. A part of me wonders, I can't read their minds, but part of me wonders the White House is just like, well, we don't really want people to talk about this. We don't want to create a firestorm on the internet, so we're just not going to say anything. That's the wrong choice. That's not an excuse. But I feel like it's so toxic. It makes that sort of the function that government's supposed to play, it makes it hard.
And this is why, getting back to your first point about Joe Biden visiting Ukraine, I guarantee you that the majority of my colleagues in the Senate aren't praising him for it. Excuse me. And so I think we have to, as leaders, we have to give credit where credit is due, rebuild some of that trust. And now there's some people, and there are lots of, in our open system, again, lots of things working against us, to your point, but this is why you don't leave a void. And I don't mean to transition, but look at the situation in Ohio with the train derailment, the lack of information, the lack of showing up, the lack of talking to people, even if all you can do is show up and say, we're on it. We're looking into it. We don't know, whether it was a brake system. We don't know whether it was a rail system. We're looking into how this could be avoided in the future. In the meantime, what do you need? We're going to get it for you. You don't have to give them everything on the first day, but you should show up and talk to people. And this lack of openness and communication in a self-governed system like ours, which is dependent on an informed electorate, is what creates this distrust. And we have a lot of.
Well, I think there's another example right here in North Dakota, Fufang. Look at the absence of information. What that allowed that to turn into. Now, ultimately, we found out the Air Force said it was a threat. Why in the world did the federal government let it get that far down the road before they spoke up? That still baffles me. I mean, you want to talk about information vacuums? There's one. It created a huge problem in Grand Forks.
Well, there's a lot of reasons, I think, but I put more blame, frankly, on the local government.
I know you.
I mean,
I'm not sure I agree with that.
There was actually an intelligence officer in the Air Force that wrote a stinging analysis, and they ignored it. The city ignored it.
Right, well, but also the Air Force came out and said, well, that's not our official position. So,
right.
I mean, that's tough. Talk about mixed signals.
It is, but this guy's now in the Space Force. He's been Major Jeremy Fox has actually been promoted. In other words, if you're a savvy Air Force community that cares about your military base, and an Air Force major, the intelligence officer, puts out an intelligence analysis that says there are a lot of things wrong with this, I think you go with that. I don't think your default is okay. Then we're going to do this other thing.
But then when the Air Force disavows it, I think that puts you in a tough position.
Well, but they didn't. They said that's not our official position. They never disavowed the information. And then not long after that, we get the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, in a public hearing of the Armed Services Committee of the Senate, saying, "I'd rather discuss it with you in a secure setting." Again, while they didn't make the decision for Grand Forks. They were sending really direct messages. And I'm a member of the Armed Services Committee. I told them for months and months and months, stop. This is a really bad idea. Well, we need something more actionable. And my concern was they wanted somebody to tell them it was okay. That was never going to happen. And I always said it was never going to happen. And probably more people certainly should have spoken. I mean, the CFIUS process was awful and not surprisingly awful. And they certainly, CFIUS certainly let Grand Forks down on the one hand. On the other hand, they did some things that sent pretty strong messages again. But finally, once CFIUS was over and the coast was clear, the Air Force did what the Air Force should have done. But we also had General Atomics put in writing that this was a threat. And it seemingly there was a certain group of people just did not want to hear that this shouldn't be built.
Maybe, but I'm pretty sure the federal government's job, by and through the Department of Defense and the Air Force and everything else, the federal government's job is to weigh in on national security threats. That is their purview. It's not the purview of the Grand Forks. Anyway, we don't need to relitigate that, but I think the federal government dropped the ball in a big way. And they should have if it's a threat, then just say it's a threat. Just say it. Come out and say it. And finally, I mean, you had to drag it out of the Air Force, and we finally got it. So, and now it's no more. So I guess that's a moot point. Let's talk Canada threat. I'll tell you. So I live not far, so far. Minot's not so far from the Canadian border. And when I was in high school, I would hear stories all the time of people who were out hunting or something and ended up in Canada by accident. Right. Because they went down a prairie trail or something, and they were chasing a goose or a deer, and all of a sudden we're in Canada. That's the status quo of our border up there. It's very loose. And listen, I don't know really what we have to defend ourselves from our friends in Canada, who are great neighbors and wonderful people, and we love it when Canadians come down and shop. And I know lots of North Dakotans that love going up into Canada for various reasons. But what's the status on the border? We're talking about northern border security. Both you and Senator Hoeven are talking about it of late. What's going on?
Well, so what's happening is there was an article a couple of weeks ago. I think it was in I don't even remember one of the national or maybe even an international publication about a dramatic increase in border crossings at the northern border. Now, that shouldn't surprise anybody. That border was pretty well shut down for a couple of years during the pandemic, and God knows we've had some serious struggles with both federal governments on loosening vaccination requirements and testing and all those things.
Getting it back and forth. I mean, just for people who don't know, I mean, maybe everybody lives in North Dakota, but if you're not along the border, right. I mean, there are farmers who have land on both sides of the border. I mean,
that's right.
They go back and forth all the time.
And remember, this is a 5,500-mile border. So that, again, putting in perspective, comparing it, to the southern borders, it's interesting. But 5,500 miles, very open and very friendly border. Now, there's some, it's gotten different over the years. We know now you're required to, or at least generally required to have a passport to cross the border. When I was just a little boy in Rolla, North Dakota, just a dozen miles or so from Canada, our family used to drive up almost weekly to a little town in Manitoba that had a lake at it, and we just basically waved at the guards as we crossed the border, and waved at the American guards as we were crossing back.
Oh yeah, I remember coming down from Alaska to visit. We'd drive the Alaska Highway, and then we'd cross into North Dakota through Portal. And come down. Right, and I remember sometimes, like, if it was late at night or something, they just wave us through. Like, all right.
Yep. Yeah. Well, we used to go up to Killarney. Same thing. All of that said, that's not the world we live in anymore. But the pandemic was really weird. And we remember the whole trucker scandal, of course, in Canada. All of that said, it's not surprising that there's a surge in crossings now. We want that. That's why we want an open border. That said, there's also been a dramatic increase in illegal crossings, and more importantly, in abductions or in arrests across the border. And I think the problem, Rob, is and we certainly can get ahead of it, but the problem is that while the southern border gets more and more attention, and by the way, gets more and more of our Customs and Border Protection agents because of the crisis at the southern border, it opens up the opportunities for mischief across a 5,500-mile stretch of land that for many of those miles isn't patrolled at all except by drones from the sky. and we don't want. I want it to be that way. I don't want to put up a wall, obviously, on the Canadian border. But we do have to get ahead of it and make sure that the cartels and others that can afford to don't take advantage of our openness and our friendliness, the Canadian border. And so I think it's good that it's in the headlines. I think it's good that that it's under a bit of a microscope. But we have to make sure that our Customs and Border Protection has the money that they need to have enough people, and this is a struggle in every agency in the government and every industry in the world, other than the Space Force. The Space Force has all the people they need because they get way more applicants than they can take. But we need to make sure that our border stays secure. I remember one time I was the chairman of the border caucus, the Northern Border Caucus in the House. The Senate doesn't have one, but in the House, and I remember I was doing an interview on one of the Sunday morning shows up in Toronto or Montreal, I forget, but one of the networks anyway across the country. And I was live, and I remember saying at that time, the concern was, Islamic extremist terrorists crossing into the United States through Canada, because Canada had lower immigration standards than the United States did. And I was doing this interview, and they asked me some question. I said, well, just remember, our North American security is only as good as our weakest link. And the host got immediately irritated at me and said, are you suggesting that Canada has a lower standard than the United States does? And I said, well, what I'm telling you is that you do have a lower standard than the United States.
Yes, demonstrably so, yes.
Yes.
If you're upset about that, then feel free to petition your government.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about CO2 pipelines. You mentioned the Ohio disaster, and I have a feeling that is going to create a situation that we saw. In fact, just as we're sitting here, I saw an email pop up from an activist group talking about bomb trains again, which we went through that as the state of North Dakota because for a while there, when we struggled with pipeline capacity, we put a lot of North Dakota oil on rail. We still put a lot of North Dakota oil on rail. And there was concern about derailments, and not unjustifiably, but
for sure.
Sometimes there's a hysteria around this stuff. And so I feel like we're going to go through it again, which is always a good time to talk about pipelines. And although these days the pipeline debate in North Dakota is about carbon pipelines, and people are pretty skeptical of them. And what really interested me, North Dakota has one of the reasons why I think North Dakota's been a leader in carbon capture. We're seeing projects get deployed. We're seeing a lot of progress on it. Despite the sneering for people saying that this will never work, I think they're going to be proven. I don't think history is going to be kind to their position. But one of the reasons North Dakota has primacy, which is that we can essentially we can permit our own carbon pipelines, is what that means, I think, in a nutshell. It's just us in Wyoming who have that. A number of other states have applied for it. But Louisiana's been trying. Louisiana doesn't have primacy. They've been trying to get a carbon pipeline built there for a couple of years. And the EPA has been sitting on it, as the EPA is wont to do. And there's no updates on it. It's become just an absolute fiasco. Now, the thing is a lot of times pipelines are multi-state projects. The big ones are anyway.
Right.
How do we get to a situation? I mean, this seems very frustrating to me. We're not talking about an oil pipeline. We're not talking about a gas pipeline. We're talking about pipelines that are going to facilitate our ability to do something the environmentalists tell us they want to do, which is take carbon out of the air and either use it for stuff or put it in the ground. And yet we're still fighting. We're still fighting this. I mean,
I think the biggest fight right now is less about the pipeline itself and the contents it carries, and more on private property rights. And does this fall into the common carrier category, or should it be eligible for a taking, a legal taking?
Eminent domain is always tricky.
Right.
Eminent domain is always
tricky. And I carried the pipeline portfolio when we being the North Dakota Public Service Commission at the time, cited the Keystone Pipeline, the original one, through 600 landowners land rob in eastern North Dakota, not through the Bakken, but through eastern North Dakota, 9 counties, and not 1 inch of it had to be taken. Not one. Now it takes a lot of zigs and zags around certain property, but none of it had to be condemned. And we've changed a lot since then. I think one of the challenges with the CO2 pipeline is I think it's different than a lot of other things. First of all, not a lot of people understand CO2. Now, I also cited a CO2 pipeline when I was on the Public Service Commission.
That's the thing that cracks me up, is everyone treats this like this is some new thing. We've had a CO2 pipeline in western North Dakota for 2 decades.
Right.
It seems to be doing okay.
when we cited that pipeline, we cited the moving of it and the burying of it under the Lake Skakawea, under the surface or the bottom of Lake Skakawea, because the water had gotten so low that the line was exposed to boats and things. They wanted to move it anyway. We had the hearing, as you're required to have by our law, in the community closely affected by it. In this case, it was Watford City. And a grand total of 0 people showed up from the public to protest or to support the pipeline. It was amazing. That was only, gosh, Rob, 15 years ago, 14 years ago, something like that.
The world's changed.
So it's the world's changed. But now we are talking about somebody else's CO2. I do think that's a little bit different. We're talking about CO2 from ethanol plants in Iowa and Minnesota. And then you're talking about burying it underground and some of it used for tertiary oil recovery. If we were talking solely about CO2 captured in our own coal-fired power plants that allowed those power plants to continue to provide low cost, energy and jobs for miners and as well as clean it all up, I think we'd be having a different discussion than if we're talking about bringing somebody else's CO2.
Yeah, but that seems like NIMBYism to me. I mean, if you want the carbon, if we want carbon capture to work for our coal plants in North Dakota and our ethanol plants in North Dakota and other applications, if we want it to work, then you got to let the industry grow, and that might mean letting people, letting companies develop a carbon industry in our state, bringing carbon from other states. That seems very cut off our nose to spite our face.
Yeah, no, I don't get me wrong. I support the pipeline. Sure. I think we have to be very careful though about how we deal with landowners that resist it or communities that resist it, and not get into an eminent domain situation that violates a higher principle, and that is private property rights. And does this really, while it helps an industry, does it? It's not a water line for providing municipal water. It's not a gas line for providing heat for homes. It's not a transmission line that provides electricity for cities and communities. It's different in that sense. And I do think it deserves a robust discussion. It's certainly getting one in the North Dakota legislature, I've noticed. And I just hope that we can have enough mutual respect to do it, but do it the right way.
I think that is true. I mean, what we've been talking about, the Summit Carbon Express line, it's not the first line in North Dakota, but it's kind of the first one in this era. And I think it's the first one where it's bringing carbon from other states, and it's got to be done right, because even if they get it through and they get it across the finish line, but they went scorched earth and they left a bunch of bad taste in a lot of people's mouth, boy, that's going to make it tough for future projects. So this one's got to be done the right way. Although I worry that because they haven't used eminent domain, and I mean they're working really hard to get. I worry some of it is just the people who just want to say no to this regardless. I mean, there's some intransigence going on as well.
There is, but yeah, there is, and that's not to say that more talking will make them less intransigent, but I do think there needs to be more talking. I really do.
Sure.
Again, if you're dug in, and you try to find a way around it. But as I said to John Boehner one time when he was Speaker of the House, I said, Mr. I noticed that there are certain people in the House that always voted no, that had more to say about things than the vast majority that wanted to do things. And I said, I cited the original Keystone Pipeline across 600 landowners' land. Not one of them had to be condemned. Not 1 inch had to be condemned, but guess which landowner made the most money per inch? And it was the 600th one. And he said, "Don't worry. Hey, we remember who were the people who were with us early." My point being that it gets harder and harder. I think they're at something like 60% or 58% of the landowners have already signed easements. That means the remaining 42 have more and more leverage.
Right.
And so it's a community effort for sure.
It's the nature of the beast.
To be careful.
But why? Let's switch. But we ended up talking about the North Dakota example,
because
and then we skipped over. But
it
seems really odd to me that President Biden's EPA is being such a stick in the mud about carbon capture and carbon pipelines when the key legislation that he campaigned on, right, in the midterms, like one of the key, had so much money for carbon capture in it, right? The American, the Reinvestment Act?
Yeah, it's actually the infrastructure bill.
Oh, that's right. The infrastructure bill. I I mean, President Biden championed that. Like, that was a good bill, and now his administration is roadblocking it. What gives, Kevin?
But I think, remember, that was a very comprehensive transportation infrastructure bill. It included, transportation of lots of things, as well as cars and trucks. But I think he did that to get the bill passed. Lots of promises. The DOE still has a lot of that money for projects, for seed money, for early investment in technological advancement and whatnot. And then, of course, we also passed the 45Q tax legislation that provides some tax incentive as well for private industry to invest in it. So there are a lot of tools out there. But remember, when you have the regulatory regime underneath you, you can stop lots of things. Remember, he always claims that no president has approved more easements or more leases for federal oil. And the fact is, no one's done less since going all the way back to LBJ. And he just says these things because well, first of all, he doesn't know, or he'll put out a word that we're going to allow all these leases, but then the permits for the applications for permits gets stonewalled, or the permits for the pipelines that would provide transportation get slowed down. There's lots of ways to keep oil in the ground or keep product in the ground through the regulatory regime while appearing to be supportive, and I think that's what they do. The bottom line is, Rob, Democrats today, led by Joe Biden, hate coal. They hate oil. They hate gas. And what I always say, and this is why I do so much, as you know, on the national level on these topics, is I don't mind if you want to reduce CO2 emissions, go for it. It seems to be that most Americans want to do that. But you don't have to pick a fuel source that you hate and make that and make every policy around that. The fuel source is not the problem. The technologies and the innovations that can make every fuel source better are the solutions. Don't discriminate against the fuel source, but rather set realistic emissions goals, and the innovators will meet them. And that's what I think we have to continue to push.
Allow coal to meet it. Allow oil to meet it. I think that's the problem, though, is they've got their hearts set on solar and wind and some of these other things, and yep. they want them to work, and they can't. They hate carbon capture because that might make coal work for another couple of generations. Yep. All right, final thing: document scandal, where we had President Trump got caught up in it, and then President Biden got caught up in it, and now, boy, it kind of seems like a lot of people are being very, very loose with classified documents. You made an interesting point, though, about document over classification, and I think probably there's a lot of journalists out there, certainly maybe not me, I don't traffic in a lot of classified stuff, but certainly national journalists who are maybe nodding their heads saying, yeah, I think we're classifying too much stuff.
I totally agree. I've believed that since the first time I went into a classified briefing in a SCIF. You go into a SCIF and you hear all this classified information, then you walk out and you see your colleagues having news conferences about everything they just heard. And so I think we do overclassify. My best example of this was when I, as you know, stood up the Space Force. I carried that legislation, helped create it, led that charge, and I went up to Cavalier, to the space station. At that time, it was still an Air Force station, but with the brand new, at that time, the very first chief of space operations, General J. Now I'm losing my mind. I'm forgetting his name anyway. And when we went up to, when the general and I went up to Cavalier, the first thing we did is went in the SCIF. Well, first thing we did is cut the ribbon on the SCIF because that was a brand new thing. And we went to the SCIF and he shared information that was highly classified about Russian satellites. And I'm sitting there going, oh my gosh, the country needs to know this. The country needs to understand that there's a pretty big problem in space and that we're behind, Russia and China in some areas, particularly low Earth orbiting satellites, offensive weapons, all these things. But we couldn't say it even to airmen outside of that SCIF. We could only say it to certain people that had a certain clearance. And we walked out, and it wasn't long after that Space Force declassified a bunch of that information. And what it was that what do they call those? The Russian dolls, I forget the nesting dolls. I forget. Yeah, the nesting dolls. That's what it was. We heard about it not long after that when we made public that we'd identified these nesting doll style satellites that Russia had in space. And it was important because I think if you want the confidence of self-governed people, and we started the show talking about this, if you want the confidence of self-governed people, you have to inform self-governed people. And if you inform them about things that are important, but maybe not as top secret as we're pretending they are, you maybe will get by with saying to them occasionally, you know what, we just can't share that information. You gain confidence with the relationship, and that confidence gained by communicating. And I just think we just overclassify, and certainly the media would agree with that, obviously, as you point out. I would bet you, Rob, that if you and I had a week and we took all of the documents that Joe Biden, Mike Pence, and Donald Trump have, and maybe some others, and we went through it all, we'd be disappointed. We would go, really? This is it? This is what this whole thing is about? That said, we should have a better system of I mean,
if they're classified, they're classified. I mean, I don't think you're defending what happened.
We don't want to treat it loosely. Yeah.
But the thing is I think when you're classifying a lot of stuff that doesn't need to be classified, that invites, I don't know, a cavalier attitude about it, which is not good.
No, that's right. But back to my point, but the Safe Space Force, Jay Raymond, the name that was escaping me, General Jay Raymond, he has been a champion of declassification, particularly in space, and he has made tremendous, I think, in some cases waves and in some cases progress at the Defense Department on this topic, because again, whether it's submarines or spy planes or spy balloons or satellites, the American public needs to know our vulnerabilities, and they need to know what our enemies are up to, so that they can feel more comfortable funding a defense system that can keep us all safe, without revealing too many secrets to our adversaries.
There's actually an excellent book that just came out that is on my list. I shouldn't say it's excellent. I haven't read it yet, but it looks excellent. I'm excited to read it. It's called The Declassification Engine: What History Reveals About America's Top Secrets, and it deals with this exact topic about our trend as sort of a lot of our classification overzealousness had its roots in World War II. Maybe it was necessary back then. I don't know, but I think it's time probably to look at that issue again. Well, Kevin, I appreciate you coming on, and thank you so much for always an interesting discussion, and really appreciate it.
I enjoyed it a lot, and I'm shocked at how much time went by so quickly, Rob. I mean, it always has, but this is really kind of amazing as I look at the clock. So hopefully you've got enough material for the week.
I think we do. Thank you.
All right, buddy. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Did you know Forum Communications Company has a robust podcast library? At inforum.com/podcasts, we have everything from politics, sports, true crime, outdoor adventure, and more. Visit inforum.com/podcasts and explore them all today.